Hi guys, it's Mark Zickrey, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickrey of Space Command. And you all know we have a Kickstarter campaign going right now at spacecommandkickstarter.com. Go there, throw money our way. There's t-shirts, there's comic books, there's downloadable videos, there's Blu-rays, DVDs, you name it, all sorts of stuff. Walk-on rolls, talk-on rolls, producer credits. I mean, I can't imagine why you have not gone yet, but go, right now, this moment. Space Command! This is a shirt you can actually get during that campaign. So, all sorts of exclusive stuff too. But today, I'm going to give you a break. That's all the talking about Space Command's Kickstarter campaign I'm going to do in this video. People have been asking me when I'm going to do my next installment of my history of science fiction, and this is it. Here we are, because this is something I've really been looking forward to for a long time. We'll see how far we get in this video. It's the science fiction films of the 80s. Now, I personally believe that the 80s and the 90s are the golden age of science fiction film. One could even make an argument that the latter part of the 70s was sort of the lead-in, the ramp-up to that, and I would agree with that. But the amazing number of wonderful science fiction films that were made during the 80s and 90s is unparalleled. And many of them began franchises that are still going. And we're going to get into all this stuff. But I'm going to do something somewhat differently this time. I'm going to start with the really big, major films that punched through and made their mark. And then I'll do a second video where I go into, you know, all the other ones that, you know, Hangar 18, Galaxina, you know, Battle Beyond the Stars. I'll talk about the B movies and below in the next video. But I'm going to start year by year with the real films that changed our world and changed us in a major way. Now, in the 70s, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg had made their bones, essentially had gotten on the map. George Lucas with Star Wars in 77, Spielberg, of course, with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and before that, Jaws. And Ridley Scott in 1979 did Alien, which put him on the map. So going into the 80s, as the 80s started, Star Wars, of course, was the huge blockbuster phenomenon. And so there was immediately a cry for there to be a sequel to it. Now, originally, you know, it was sort of a standalone film, and but now we get the trilogy. So, of course, this was the paperback of Star Wars of the first film, with the great Ralph McQuarrie cover. Although it's credited to George Lucas, the actual author of this book is Alan Dean Foster, who was writing as George Lucas's ghostwriter. And then, of course, later they would come out with the trilogy in novel form, and my friend James Caan wrote the third of those, which we'll get to. But Empire Strikes Back is generally considered the greatest of the first three Star Wars films, and many might even say the greatest Star Wars film, period. It was directed by Irvin Kershner. It's darker than the others. It's moodier. It has a great reveal at the end about someone who turns out to be someone else's relative. If you've never seen it, I don't know what you're doing watching Mr. Sci-Fi. Go out and see The Return of the Jedi and The Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars right now, in that order. Completely confuse yourself. But it's a beautifully made film in every respect. The production design's terrific. The costumes, the sets, the lighting, the acting. It's just terrific. Now, I believe between the first and the second film, Mark Hamill had been in a very bad car crash and they'd had to reconstruct his face. But in Empire Strikes Back, that gave his face more seriousness, more drama, and it really fit. It, you know, he'd been a little bit callow looking in Star Wars, a little bit like, I want to be a Jedi, you know. And but here he's learning to be a Jedi, and of course this is the movie that introduced Yoda, another great character, one of the few puppets in science fiction that really works as a character. Many productions tried it, and you would always say, well, that's just a puppet running around. Yoda, they pulled it off, and Frank Oz, of course, did the voice. Just phenomenal and wonderful in every way. So that was what kicked off the 70s with that coming out early in the decade. And then we got another director was rising, you know, making his mark. Now, he had a film called Dark Star in the 70s, and then he would start this amazing run of really terrific films in the 80s, and that was John Carpenter. And he did Escape from New York, which is around here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. He did Escape from New York, which is a really fun film starring Kurt Russell and Adrienne Barbeau, who was married to him at the time, and Amy Madigan, and it's just a fun film, and that would be ramping up to what I consider his greatest film. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it was during this decade you had a lot of dystopic science fiction. You had also space opera with Star Wars. You had serious science fiction, which we'll get to. It was a really wonderful time where the writers and the directors and the actors all rose to the challenge. And also during this period, you didn't have it overwhelmed by CG like you tend to now. CG was just starting to be used, but most of the effects you were seeing were actual, what are called practicals, real explosions, things like that. And then also they were doing miniatures, and the Shostak brothers were very, very good at that, and there were a number of people, Greg Jean, where they were making miniatures that were just astonishing, and many of our favorite films, you got to see their work, and it was just beautifully done in every way. So then another director came on the scene during this period. He'd had one film that had come out, not really made much of a dent here in the States, and he made a sequel to it, oddly enough, and the sequel, surprisingly, was far better than the original film. Now, the original film he'd done that barely got noticed here was called Mad Max, and it had a young man who had an Australian accent, and the American distributors thought that was just a joke, and so they dubbed this young man into an American accent, and his name was Mel Gibson. And so if you ever see the original release version of Mad Max from America, it'll have him talking with a very different voice. And but this was not a bad film, but a little bit dystopic, but not what was coming. And the sequel was called Mad Max 2 in Australia, but here, because Mad Max 1 hadn't made much of a dent, it was retitled The Road Warrior. And this was just a revolution, because a lot of people had tried dystopia, and it ended up often looking silly. And there were many ripoffs of this movie. But this is where the Road Warrior universe really established itself. The look of it, the feel of it, the tone of it, the nonstop action. Just a terrific movie. Mel Gibson is terrific in it. It made his reputation. He became a major A-list movie star. And George Miller proved himself an A-list director, and he went on to many other things, and then came back full circle with Mad Max Fury Road, which I think is a great film. But this is the real deal. So then, after that, you got, continuing on with my little list here. Now there was another director named Peter Hyams, and he was not the top of the heap, but he did some very imaginative science fiction films throughout the 80s, and one of them was this one. It's called Outland. Now, science fiction, of course, is very durable, and it can accommodate a lot of riffs and a lot of genres, and this is a science fiction western. Now, Sean Connery at the time had been, was famous for playing James Bond, but he was also in many other films as well. He's a wonderful actor, and he's very good in this, and has Francis Sternhagen as well. And this is Outland, which is basically a science fiction version of High Noon, which had been a western starring, a western during the 50s that had been very renowned with Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly. But this is a science fiction version of it set in a mining colony and out in the outer reaches of the solar system, and it's a fun movie. I own 2 of the spacesuits from this movie, which you'll probably see in Space Command sooner rather than later. But this is a film I can recommend. It's very strong. And so then at the same point we get to another director who rose up through the ranks was David Cronenberg, and Scanners came out, and it's a very solid science fiction film. But again, that would be an arrow toward his great work in the later part of the decade. But then that same year, 1982, again, an incredible year for science fiction, we came out with one of the greatest films, not just one of the greatest science fiction films, one of the greatest films ever made, and that is Blade Runner. Now, this is just an astonishing film. It's based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, who also wrote The Man in the High Castle. And this was an example of the perfect director with the perfect material, and it changes genre. It's basically a sort of Philip K. Dick book, and Ridley Scott turned it into future noir. and it's very much in the tradition of the noir film, in the tradition of the classic detective novel, along the lines of, Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep, but set in the future. And it was a terrific future. And because Ridley Scott had a very small back of the Warner's back lot to work with to create his future city, he filled it with smoke, he filled it with extra actors, and bunching them close together, he just poured as much as he could and into it. And Francis Ford Coppola had just done a movie called One from the Heart that tanked, but he built his own version of Vegas, and he had this enormous amount of neon signs, and Ridley Scott got wind of it, and he bought the neon from that production and filled Blade Runner with all that neon, and it had astonishing visual effects by Douglas Trumbull, amazing designs by Sid Mead. It had Greg Jean, my friend Greg Jean, built the city, which I've got part of over there on the wall. I'll bring it next time, and it's just got an astonishing cast of, there's no topping. Harrison Ford, Ridley Scott, on and on. I mean, just everyone is fabulous in this film. So if you've never seen Blade Runner, I urge you to. It's an interesting thing because originally it came out and it had this dopey narration on it, and it had many differences from later prints. And this is the director's final print, but there's a very interesting disagreement between the star and the director, because Ridley Scott says, yes, Deckard is an android, a replicant, and Harrison Ford says, no, he isn't. So in the sequel, in Blade Runner 2049, it kind of split the difference. It left it up in the air. But this version, the director's cut, seems to indicate that Deckard is a replicant, but it's clearly, there's a shot where his eyes glow, and it's clearly a mistake, clearly an outtake, and so I prefer to think that Deckard isn't an android, because that makes his journey a human journey, and which I like very much. But whichever version you see, this is just a spectacular film. I love this beyond words. And I highly recommend it if you've never seen it. So that was 1982, continuing on, and we're not even done. Then Spielberg did a movie. Originally, he wanted to do something that was sort of the flip side of Close Encounters, and he came up with this notion of these malevolent aliens attacking a town. And he hired John Sayles, a very, very popular and talented screenwriter, to do the script, and he brought aboard Ron Cobb, the amazing designer from Alien and many other great films and Close Encounters and on and on. He brought aboard Ron Cobb to direct it, and they started developing it. But as it started to develop, and you can read that script, you can get it on eBay and probably also online. But as it started to develop, it started to change, and finally Spielberg came to Ron Cobb, who was a dear friend of mine and who was a designer on Space Command, and he said to Cobb, if you step down, I'll give you $10,000 and 2 of my points, my back-end points. And so Cobb did so, and Spielberg took it over, and it became a movie called E.T. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And Cobb, of course, never had to work again, because those back-end points were gross points and included merchandising. And E.T. was a huge hit. And it's a heartwarming film. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't, you should. And it has one of the oddest looking aliens in the history of science fiction film. And oddly, I don't have somewhere I've got the paperback book that the novelization that William Kotzwinkle did, but God knows where. But I recommend that film, and it's very touching, and it does hold up. So, but we're not even done with 1982. Continuing on, another one of my favorite films is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and directed by Nicholas Meyer, and he had his hands in the script as well, and Harve Bennett produced it, and the evolution of this film is very, very interesting. It was Star Trek: The Motion Picture made a profit, and it was a big blockbuster movie, but it was very kind of snoozy. It's basically, let's fly through this alien ship, on and on, flying through this alien ship, and then at the end it's like, oh look, it's Voyager, and it's like da-da-da-da, and it was kind of dopey, and all of the good character stuff was cut out of it for the theatrical release, and then fortunately the director, Robert Wise, had a chance to go back and make the director's cut, which at the moment is only available on DVD, but definitely seek it out. It's far better. But then Paramount had the idea of, that was successful, but the fans didn't really like it that much because it didn't have what they had wanted. And so they brought aboard a TV producer named Harve Bennett to supervise the next one. And Nicholas Meyer was a big director at that time, a very, very well-known writer for The 7% Solution and The Day After and many other things. He may have done The Day After Wrath of Khan, who recalls? It was definitely in that time period. But he had done Time After Time, which was a wonderful science fiction film. So all of these great talents were brought together, and they said, well, what are we going to do? It had to be a lower budget than the Star Trek The Motion Picture, because that had been very expensive. So they said, well, let's use the sets we've got from that. Let's use some of the footage we've got from that, the visual effects footage, and see what we can cobble together. And Leonard Nimoy had said, well, I'll only come back if you kill me. He didn't want to do Star Trek anymore. And so, okay, that was going to be in the deal. So they knew it was going to be the death of Spock. So they started developing different ideas. Like one was about the Genesis device. And, and it wasn't kind of coalescing. But Harv Bennett, meanwhile, who had not been a Star Trek fan, sat down and he watched all 79 Star Trek episodes. And he was looking for a thread that he could weave into a sequel, into a second Star Trek film. And interestingly enough, he didn't choose one of the standout episodes that everyone talked about, like Trouble with Tribbles or City on the Edge of Forever, or any of those, the big ones, the notable ones. He chose one that was sort of a dark horse candidate. There was a first season episode called Space Seed, and it starred Ricardo Montalban as an Indian prince, and there were these eugenics wars, and he and his genetically adapted humans, who were stronger and smarter and all of that, were sent out into space, and the Enterprise encounters them, and stuff happens, and Kirk ends up marooning them on a planet. And so Harv Bennett said, well, that could be a Moby Dick kind of thing where Khan, Ricardo Montalban's character, is out to get Kirk, get revenge for what happened to him. And the penny dropped, and all of these different elements of the script came together, and they reached out to Ricardo Montalban to reprise his role. But the interesting question was, okay, what would he look like? What would he seem like? Now, at the time, Ricardo Montalban was starring on a very successful TV show called Fantasy Island, and he played Mr. Rourke, and he was very urbane, and he had short hair, and relatively short hair, and he was kind of this Latino guy, this kind of good-looking guy, and he was the host of the island, Fantasy Island. And at first, when he got the script, he sort of in front of a mirror was trying to do a reading of it as that sort of doing the same Mr. Rourke thing, and he very quickly realized that wasn't going to work. He was going to have to completely create an entirely new character, not just different from the character he played on Fantasy Island, but also an evolution of the character he played in Star Trek, because the original Space Seed episode, he was good, but it wasn't brilliant. And so he pulled out all the stops in creating Khan, and they gave him this wonderful wig, and they gave him this wonderful costume, and often people asked, is that a fake chest, because he has such a muscular chest that's exposed, and no, that was his chest. He lifted weights, he was in very good shape, and that really is him, and he gives a phenomenal performance, and on Mr. Sci-Fi you can check out Nicholas Meyer talking about directing Wrath of Khan, and talking about getting around Shatner's mannerisms, because Shatner turns in a very good performance, and they brought back the entire Star Trek cast, and they're all wonderful in this. And Kirstie Alley is great as Saavik. Later she'd be a star on Cheers, and this is just a delightful movie. This is the director's cut. It doesn't really differ that much. It's not like Robert Wise's director's cut on Star Trek The Motion Picture, which you've got to see if you're any kind of Star Trek fan. This version, you can watch the theatrical release, you can watch this. It's got a few little more bells and whistles, but but either version is going to be just wonderful. And their use of the sets and the visual effects shots from the first movie works great. They make some improvements, like they have video screens rather than projection screens for the computer screens for the Enterprise bridge. Interestingly enough, there's no scene in which Ricardo Montalban and William Shatner are physically together in the scene. It's all view screens, and it never registers as being odd. It really works. It's just a wonderful film, and it came out and it was a hit, and that generated many more Star Trek movies, and also it generated Star Trek: The Next Generation, which debuted and was a hit as well. But that was definitely. But Wrath of Khan, where Star Trek, the motion picture, had sort of allowed Star Trek to expand into the movies. This is the film that really set the tone for what a Star Trek film could be and should be, because it had action, it had heart, it had character, it had everything you would want in a Star Trek film. And there began to be a joke that Star Trek films the even numbered ones were good and the odd numbered ones were bad. And so some people held it that 1, 3, and 5 weren't as good as 2, 4, and 6 of the Star Trek movies. But again, it's, you know, if you love Star Trek 3 or if you love the motion picture, you know, or any of that, you're you know, you're welcome to have that affection for it. Now we get to another kind of film entirely that came out the same year, 1982, a banner year for science fiction film. And this is very interesting because in 1979, Ridley Scott had proved that you could merge science fiction and horror extremely effectively, and horror films too had been ramping up. You got Halloween and The Fog, and you got, you know, many very effective horror films through the 70s. And John Carpenter, who had sort of made a name for himself in the 70s with Dark Star, and I think he'd done Halloween by then and so forth, into the 80s, he decided to make a science fiction horror film, and the one he made was Without Peer. And he was a huge fan of Howard Hawks, and he loved the 1950s version of the thing that Howard Hawks and Chris Nyby did, and this is the book edition of that. It was called Who Goes There? It was written by a novella written by John W. Campbell, and in fact, this edition of it is signed. That signature is actually John Campbell. Go figure. Not John Campbell. Sorry, it's John Carpenter. This is the first edition, and this one is actually signed by John W. Campbell, who has a you know, handwriting almost as unreadable as John Carpenter's. But the point is that John Carpenter, in the 1950s version of the thing, which was successful, the whole idea of a shape-shifting alien was not really addressed. The original short story took place at an Antarctic station where they dig up a frozen alien for thousands. It's been frozen for thousands of years, and he thaws out and starts impersonating, making duplicates of the humans, basically taking them over. It's a sort of a group mind creature, and it was one of the great horror stories. And John Carpenter decided to make it a literal adaptation, and he went about it brilliantly. It was another film, as with Escape from New York, that Kurt Russell did and starred in, and it has a phenomenal ensemble cast. Wilford Brimley, many others. Everyone in it is just terrific. It's one of the few films where you really feel the cold, you know, because it just feels like it's freezing out there. And the visual effects that are just spectacular, the prosthetic effects, the creature effects. Rob Bottin, who was, I think, barely 21 at the time, sculpted these creatures. Amazing work. And you know, he had others helping him who would go on to greatness as well, but Ron Winston, but he was the main driver of the brilliance of that work, and it's one of my favorite films. Also, I watch it over and over, and it's funny and dark and scary and graphic, and it was too graphic for audiences and critics at the time. It came out and E.T. basically kicked its ass. You know, E.T. got all the money, all the attention, and the thing was just basically viewed as too graphic, too dark, and sank like a stone. Over the years, though, it's come to be recognized as the great classic that it is. It's my favorite John Carpenter film, and you know, if you've never seen it, again, rush out immediately and see it. And again, whereas Hannes Bach's terrific cover of the book isn't as creepily weird as the movie, as the creatures in John Carpenter's Thing, but this is sort of almost like an inspiration or a jumping off point, because it's a very horrific and creepy and strange image, and so I again, it's just, you know, phenomenal, just a phenomenal film. So now, continuing on, we get to Tron. Now again, somewhere I probably have that movie. It was the first movie that really utilized CG, and it starred Jeff Bridges. It was not a great film, but it was an interesting film, and it was sort of in a cyberspace world, and again, one of the landmark films, simply in the fact that a lot of people were inspired by it. A lot of stuff happened. There was a ripple effect. They later made another Tron film, of course, that was not as distinctive, but this one really was a bellwether of what was to come. And it's not a bad film. Beyond that, we continue on. So now we're continuing to move through the 80s, and we get to Return of the Jedi. Now that's the third film of the first Star Wars trilogy. Of course, who doesn't know that? My friend James Caan did the novelization, and it's good, but not as good as the second film, of course. And my friend Michael Reeves called it Return of the First Movie because it has another Death Star in it. I've always found Star Wars a little limited in its bag of tricks, and it's gotten better now in recent years, but with The Mandalorian and so forth. But it was a huge hit. All three of the first Star Wars films were huge hits. Harrison Ford became a big movie star. Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill were, renowned for these roles, and they should have been. And James Earl Jones, of course, as the voice of Darth Vader, along with David Prowse playing the physical Darth Vader. It just paid off. When they talk about the more recent Star Wars films being kind of a mess, it's because they don't pay off satisfactorily. They don't pay off emotionally the way the first three did. And some people can have their complaints about the Ewoks, but George Lucas was trying to do a film that was commenting on Vietnam, the idea of a guerrilla insurgency being able to defeat a technological superpower, and that was his thinking. And but it's a fun film. It's a delightful film. It has wonderful effects, wonderful design, and really holds up as well. So definitely, if you haven't seen the first three Star Wars films, they're well worth seeing. And but I think this was the turning point. Return of the Jedi was the turning point where Lucas decided that these were going to be children's films, that they were going to be mainly aimed at children. And whereas in the first film, Star Wars, the first film, he had not been able to get a toy deal. By the time, as soon as Star Wars hit big, all the toy companies wanted to come out with Star Trek merchandise. And so by the time he gets to the third film, realizing what a huge cash cow that is, I think his mind was, okay, let's make this so we can have a ton of toys. And so, whereas Empire Strikes Back seems to be a much more adult kind of film, by the time he gets to Return of the Jedi, it's clearly intended for children. But still, entertaining. And if you were a kid during this period, you never left the Star Wars universe by all likelihoods. At the same time as Return of the Jedi, you got Twilight Zone the movie, and it was an attempt to bring back Twilight Zone. Everyone in fantasy and science fiction and horror who grew up watching the Twilight Zone loved it. And there would be an attempt to revive the TV show later in the 80s, but at this point they did Twilight Zone the movie, and they did adaptations of two stories, Kick the Can and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and then they also did an original that was somewhat inspired by a novella that Rod Serling had written, and of course, Spielberg was the driving force behind it. George Miller, coming off Road Warrior, did a terrific adaptation of Nightmare 20,000 Feet. I still prefer the original episode with William Shatner. I think it tells more of a human story, and the character isn't just thrown away at the end. But George Miller's version with John Lithgow is just, an adrenaline rush all the way through, and it's spectacularly done, and the creature's terrific. And again, it's my favorite, I think, of the segments in that film. And I don't much like Spielberg's Kick the Can. I vastly prefer the original episode. And then, of course, the one that was done with Vic Morrow. There was an accident, and 2 children were killed by a helicopter crashing. Pyrotechnics fired up and hit the camera copter, and it crashed and killed Vic Morrow and killed 2 children. And there was a big trial and so forth. And it was just a tragedy. So that really put a damper on the film, and just really kind of left a bad taste in pretty much everyone's mouth. I think the movie made a profit, but Spielberg definitely tried to distance himself as soon as that happened. Joe Dante also did a version of It's a Good Life in that film as well, and it's entertaining. But I much prefer the original version with Billy Mumy. So. But again, the movie's worth seeing, but not, but very, very sad given what happened. So now at the same time, I mentioned Peter Hyams earlier, who had done Outland, the Sean Connery movie. Now, by the time we get to 1984, he does 2010, which is a sequel to Arthur C. Clarke's and Stanley Kubrick's classic game-changing film of 1968, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, it's funny because when 2001 came out, Arthur C. Clarke was not intending to write a sequel. But then with Voyager, the Voyager probes, they'd realized Voyager was originally just going to go by, I think, one planet, but someone did the calculations and realized that using the slingshot effect of looping around different planets to accelerate and change course, they could actually make what was called the Grand Tour. The plans were in a line to where they could go to Saturn and Jupiter and all the outer planets, basically. And as a result, all of a sudden, all of these amazing moons, these Jovian moons, we got photos of them. And they weren't at all like our moon. They were astonishingly varied. And on Europa, it looked like there was an under the ice, there was a liquid ocean. And this was just thrilling. And Arthur C. Clarke, because the original 2001, in the novel, it was originally set with as an expedition to Saturn, but in the movie, Kubrick had changed it to Jupiter because they had a hell of it. They had trouble trying to make the rings work visually, and so they made it Jupiter. And so when we saw all these Jovian moons that were so astonishing, Arthur C. Clarke decided, well, I'm gonna write a novel that's a sequel to 2001 where we can really explore some of those moons, particularly Europa. And so he brought the characters back. He brought back HAL 9000. He brought back Keir Dullea character. And he wrote this book, which was a big bestseller. And basically the critics thought, well, it's not 2001, it's not of that quality, but it's a solid science fiction novel. Then he would go on to do several more sequels. And but Peter Hyams took on this one. And it's not in the same class as 2001. 2001 was there's nothing comparable to it before or since. It was just astonishing brilliance in every way. But 2010 is a fun film, and has a wonderful cast headed up by Roy Scheider, who plays the lead scientist in it, and Keir Dullea is in it, and the voice Douglas Rain, who did the voice of HAL 9000, is in it. And it's got a Russian cast and an American cast, and it also has the wonderful Helen Mirren. Now, interestingly enough, she's of Russian lineage, and she spoke Russian fluently. And so she's playing the captain of the Russian ship. She's beautiful, she's commanding, she's quite wonderful, and she and Roy Scheider are really great in scenes together. So I can recommend this film. It isn't 2001, but it's definitely a very solid and entertaining science fiction film. Oh, by the way, here's the Blu-ray of The Thing, special edition, and again, there's Kurt Russell and the rest of the cast. And it also has a phenomenal dog in it, to mention that. So then we come to one of the great classics of science fiction, and the first attempt to make it as a movie, and that is Dune. This is the first edition of Frank Herbert's Dune. Came out in the 60s. It was, again, a game changer. And so they approached David Lynch to write and direct a movie adaptation of Dune. Now, David Lynch was coming off some great films, very dark films that he was making, very weird films, and he had an amazing visual sense, and so this is Dune. Now, a lot of people really hate this movie. I rather like it. His design sense is unique, and it's got a really cool cast. It has Kyle MacLachlan, who'd later be on Twin Peaks, and it's got Sting in it as one of the villains, and I find it entertaining and interesting, and the visual effects are funky, but the ships are interesting. In this version, it has deleted scenes. It's got a lot of different things. Now, we should mention that this was not the first attempt to make Dune into a movie. Alejandro Jodorowsky tried that before this version, and it fell apart. And that's where he brought together H.R. Giger and Mobius and all these astonishing artists. And there's a great documentary on that film, because that film was hugely influential. It very strongly influenced Alien with H.R. Giger. It very strongly influenced Blade Runner. Mobius would go on to be a designer on many films of the science fiction classics. This was, so Jodorowsky's Dune was incredibly influential, even though it never got made. And but David Lynch's Dune is worth a look-see. Denis Villeneuve, of course, has completed a new film of Dune, which will be hopefully the first in a multi-film series. he wants it to be shown on the big screen. That's why it's been delayed. Hopefully it'll be great. The word on the street is that it's a good film. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But again, if you've never seen David Lynch's Dune, it's peculiar. It doesn't entirely work, but it has some things worth checking out. There was also another film called The Adventures of Buckaroo Bonsai Across the Eighth Dimension, which is a fun film. And I mention it here. It's got Peter Weller in it. It's got John Lithgow. And Jeff Goldblum, all of whom would distinguish themselves in other science fiction movies. But it doesn't quite work. It's an attempt to make a cult film deliberately, and it's got a lot of the DNA of Doc Savage. There's never been a good Doc Savage movie. Doc Savage was a very popular pulp hero from the 30s on, and but this is a film. It's interesting. It's got some cool stuff in it. It's wacky. Again, another film worth checking out. Then we get to another rarity. I talked earlier about how science fiction films would try to combine genres. And let me see, it's somewhere around here. Here it is. Okay. So with Alien and with The Thing, science fiction was combined with the horror genre. So now, in this year, in 1984, a film came out that was combining the science fiction genre, the horror genre, and comedy. And there are very few really good science fiction comedies. They're very, very rare. There are many comedies that try to be good in science fiction. They usually fall flat on their face. But the movie that came out, there are several actors who distinguished themselves on the National Lampoon Radio Hour and then Saturday Night Live. And so Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, Rick Moranis, Harold Ramis. I mean, a lot of them were Canadian. A lot of them came also off SCTV. And then, of course, Sigourney Weaver, who had made a huge name for herself with Alien and had become a big movie star. She's in this film, too. And the film, of course, is Ghostbusters. And it was just terrific. Many wonderful visual effects and just worked in every way, shape, and form. A terrific film. Sigourney Weaver and Bill Murray had great chemistry. And it just was, and it launched a franchise. And I, of course, wrote for the real Ghostbusters, the animated show based on this. But then later in the decade, you'd also get Ghostbusters 2, which is not as good a film, but is an interesting film. But boy, Ghostbusters is just one of a kind. And there's a new Ghostbusters film coming out. We'll see if it's good. The one with the all-women Ghostbusters left a lot to be desired. It was a misfire, but the original Ghostbusters was just terrific, and it was great fun, I must say, writing those characters for the real Ghostbusters. I feel very honored to have been part of that. Another comedy, horror, science fiction film that came out same year was Gremlins, and I don't have something from Gremlins to show, but it was very fun. It had practical creatures. It's about these cute little fuzzy creatures that turn into monsters, and it's just fun and goofy. Joe Dante directed it. He and Christopher Columbus wrote it, Chris Columbus, and it's another one of these delightful romps. Joe Dante is a huge animation nut, and that frenetic sensibility enters into his films. He'd come out of the Roger Corman School. He's a really nice guy, a really brilliant cineast. He knows a lot about movies, and charming guy. And Gremlins was his big hit, and just deservedly so. And if you've never seen it, again, what makes it work by my lights is if it were done now, it'd be CG creatures and they'd be fake as hell, and it wouldn't work. But the fact that they were puppets lends them a certain tactile quality, and I believe Rick Baker made the creatures himself. The great Rick Baker. I'd have to double check that. I'm pretty sure that that's the case. And it has Phoebe Cates in it, and Zach Galligan, and Hoyt Axton, just solid actors doing a really good job. So it's another one of those incredibly solid films that sparked a number of sequels and a number of rip-offs. And but again, if you've never seen it, this is just basically the decade to really check out. Another film I'll mention is The Last Starfighter. Not entirely successful in every way, but certainly worth checking out. Ron Cobb was the designer on it, and it's got some very interesting design. It tried to be entirely CG, and the CG is not quite ready for prime time yet. But again, not a bad job at all, and worth checking out. So let's see. I think I had it somewhere, but it's not popping up, so I won't show the the box of that one. Maybe I have, nope, not there. So okay, well, continuing on. Now this was the year 1984, and so 1984 was, of course, the year of George Orwell's classic. We just did a multi-part series on radio and TV and film adaptations of 1984, but in this year, you got two versions of 1984, one official and one unofficial. The official one, of course, starred John Hurt, was directed by Michael Radford, was very dark, had Richard Burton in it, and Cyril Cusack, who had been also in Fahrenheit 451 in 1967. And it was a very solid film, a very estimable film, but very dark, very depressing. But meantime, the same year, the great version of 1984 came out, and that is Brazil. And is not generally acknowledged as an adaptation of 1984, but it certainly is. And when I talk about this film in my 1984 series of commentaries, I go into that in detail. But this is a great film. It's written and directed by Terry Gilliam, and Tom Stoppard also was a writer on it, and it is visually odd and wonderful, and it has many wonderful actors in it, including Jonathan Pryce and Robert De Niro. And Jonathan Pryce later would be in such things as Game of Thrones, but he is a very skilled actor, and this is a very disturbing and peculiar and interesting and funny film. So if you've never seen Brazil, I recommend that to you, and you will not be ill-served. Now, at the same time, that same year, 1984, we got even more Star Trek movies. And here's Star Trek, the original cast motion picture collection, and on Blu-ray, which includes Star Trek 3. Now, after being in Star Trek 2, which was such a great movie, Leonard Nimoy said to Nicholas Meyer, well, maybe I was mistaken in insisting that Spock die. So they shot this extra little scene at the end of the coffin, Spock's coffin, that's rocketed off into space after his funeral. It lands on the Genesis planet with the suspicion that maybe the Genesis planet will bring Spock back to life. So Star Trek 3, yes, they bring him back to life, and Shatner was very pissed off because he hadn't been told that Spock was going to be coming back, and he and Leonard Nimoy had butted heads over the years, and but then it was kind of get used to it, and so they did Star Trek 3. Leonard Nimoy insisted that he direct it, so he was allowed to direct it, and he did a good job. And Spock comes back, and they recast the role of Saavik. And Kirstie Alley, I thought, was terrific. The new actress, not as strong. But, and this was a Klingon one. It had Klingons in it. And Christopher Lloyd, who is a very sort of over-the-top actor, plays a Klingon. He's good. He's interesting. He's memorable. But it's not my favorite Star Trek film. It's okay. It's okay, but it's not. It doesn't have the same heart that Wrath of Khan had. So, or even Star Trek the Motion Picture, for that matter. So, but definitely, it's fun. And if you want something to entertain you, go for it. Now we mentioned John Carpenter a moment ago. He also directed another film that same year called Starman. And I don't really like it much, but it's about an alien who comes to Earth in human form, and Jeff Bridges plays the alien, and it's not a terrible movie. I just find it a little funky, but as Jeff Bridges and Karen Allen from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Charles Martin Smith, and it's okay. It's kind of a romance. But it was a big hit at the time, and which is why I mention it. So then, the next film on the list is another film that changed the game, entirely changed the game. Now, The Outer Limits had done 2 episodes by Harlan Ellison. Both were about someone from the future coming into the present, one of which was a soldier from the future coming into the present, and it had this very devastated landscape. And the director of The Terminator saw this as a boy, and it certainly left an imprint. Now, one can debate whether or not Harlan Ellison had a right to sue, but if you look at this movie now, it says we acknowledge the works of Harlan Ellison. The director was very upset. The writer-director was very upset about this because he did not in any way, shape, or form want Harlan Ellison to be credited. He felt that it was original, and it was. It did have its own very specific story and very specific tone. And now many films had tried, many TV shows and films had tried killer robots, killer robots. And from Westworld, and before that, you had, the Colossus of New York. You had There Stood Still with Gort. The threat of a mechanical creature coming after human beings and being unstoppable had been tried many times, but it had never really clicked in the way that this did. And the actress who was cast, it put her on the map. And there was an actress I met years ago, and she told me a very sad story, which was she was up for the lead. She had been offered the lead in 2 movies, one of which was a Neil Simon film, and Neil Simon was a very, very hot playwright at the time, and the other was this low-budget film made by an unknown writer-director, and she would have been the female lead in it. But her agent, and she had liked that script. That's the one she'd want to say yes to. But her agent said, no, take the Neil Simon. Are you crazy? That's a surefire hit. You don't want to be in some movie that's going to sink like a stone from some unknown guy. So she took the Neil Simon role, and the movie tanked. And the movie she had turned down the female lead in was, of course, The Terminator. And so Linda Hamilton took the role instead. It put her on the map. It made her name. And this, of course, it starred Arnold Schwarzenegger, who already was a star, but this really made him, stratospheric. And it also had Michael Biehn. Everything about this film is just spectacular. It's just there's nothing. Stan Winston did the creature effects. And I mentioned with the thing, I meant to say Stan Winston. If I didn't say Stan Winston, I meant to. But this is one of the great core science fiction films. It, again, ripped off many times. It's also had official sequels, and Terminator 2 3D theme park attraction for a while that no longer exists, but you can watch it on YouTube. But this is just a great film. It's about a killer robot from the future that's sent back to kill the woman who will be the mother of the leader of the resistance. So, but again, if you've never seen Terminator, you have missed a phenomenal film. It really holds up. There's a few of the effects that are a little dicey, but overall it is a brilliant film, and James Cameron really established himself with this film. And by then he had gotten the assignment on the Aliens sequel, and so he tested out a lot of things on Terminator to make sure they would work. They was then going to use on Aliens. So this was a low budget film. I think it was made for $10 million, but it really, and it was a huge blockbuster. It made a ton of money. So there we are with that. So then moving on, we get Back to the Future. Now, again, I don't have something to show on that, but again, Ron Cobb designed the DeLorean with Andy Probert. It had Michael J. Fox, who was a big star from a TV show that he was on, what's a family, whatever it was, Family Ties. And it's another science fiction comedy that works. And Robert Zemeckis directed it. He was part of Spielberg's stable of directors, and it has Christopher Lloyd, who is also the Klingon in Star Trek 3. It's got Leah Thompson, who was a well-known actress of the time, and Michael J. Fox. Originally, there was a different actor cast in the lead, but he didn't have that manic energy that Michael J. Fox had, so they recast it. You can still see the other actor in various shots in Back to the Future if you look closely, but this was a broad comedy, time travel comedy. The DeLorean was the perfect time machine. Of course, many collectors have made their own DeLorean time machines. Unfortunately, they don't travel in time, but it was just it's just a delightful film, and it too spun off sequels and was its own brand of wonderful and just great. So now we come to another film. We haven't talked yet about another young director who had made a name for himself. He'd been an actor, and then he became a director, and he made a film called Cocoon that had Wilford Brimley from The Thing, as well as Don Amici, Hume Cronin, Brian Dennehy, Steve Guttenberg, Maureen Stapleton, Jessica Tandy. And it was about an alien egg that lands in an old folks retirement community, and they're rejuvenated. And it was kind of this delightful film, this kind of film that took you into its own world, and very charming, and again, a big hit of the time. Now we get to another film that was really emblematic, and this film, let's see where I can find it. Here it is. Now, in the late 60s, George Romero had done Night of the Living Dead, and he had created the first really new monster in a long time, the zombies, where you can kill them by shooting them in the head, and they eat human flesh, etc. And I mean, there'd been zombies before, but that was voodoo, and it would be set in Haiti and all this nonsense. He made the zombie the way the zombies are now in movies. And he did a sequel, and it was called Dawn of the Dead, and that came out in the 70s. And then he made Day of the Dead, the third of his trilogy. Day of the Dead was a fun film, and it continued the master making the world that he had created fully formed. So that was the trilogy of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and then Day of the Dead in 3 different decades. He would go on to make other films, and sadly we just lost him, but he even came out with a novel that came out recently about zombies. And so I'm going to read that in the near future and see what I think of it. But George Romero was a dear man, again, a sweetheart of a guy, and Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead spawned an entire genre of film and TV show and book and comic book and even radio play and audiobooks. I mean, it was the real deal. And so that was successful as well. Now, we spoke about Mad Max, and of course, even though the first Mad Max had sunk like a stone, the Road Warrior, Mad Max 2, had been a big hit. So out came Mad Max 3, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And it's a wonderful film. And Mel Gibson's very solid. I wish he'd been Mad Max in Fury Road. I don't think that he deserved the fate he got. I mean, someone's been drinking, they say things they shouldn't. I mean, gee whiz, they shouldn't have put that out. In the old days, the Errol Flynn days, when the studios protected their actors, that never would have gotten into the press. But Mel Gibson was the real deal. He absolutely was a wonderful actor who could do physical action, who could play sensitivity. And this is a great movie. And they got the wonderful, superlative Tina Turner to play the villain-ish person. And it's set in a dystopian future, and it has these kids who are sort of like a cargo cult. And it is, and one thing I'll say about George Miller that I really admire and I really like, he set up a universe that had its own specific rules, but he doesn't just do the same story over and over. Mad Max is different from The Road Warrior. The Road Warrior is different from Thunderdome. And of course, Mad Max Fury Road is different from all of them. Set in the same universe, but telling different stories in that universe. And it's one of my favorite directors, and Thunderdome is a swell movie, just a swell movie. So then, continuing on, we get to, now when I said that George Romero created his own genre of film, in 1979, Alien had come out, and Dan O'Bannon, who wrote the movie Alien and came up with it with Ron Shusett. He had previously starred and written, co-written, and John Carpenter and he, when they were college students, did a film called Dark Star, which was very funny, a science fiction film that was very, very funny. And Dan O'Bannon then went and took a notion of an alien, an escaped alien, took that notion, made it into a horror film, and that became Alien. So now, in the 80s, he was a big A-list screenwriter, and a number of his things were getting made, and a number of them weren't. Total Recall was getting made, Blue Thunder, but he wanted to become a director, and so he made his own zombie film. But it was, George Romero had comedy in his zombie films too, but this was even one step further, and this was Return of the Living Dead, written and directed by Dan O'Bannon. And it is a fun film, and it has Clu Gulager in it, who a friend of mine is making a documentary about, and James Caron, whom I met at Leonard Maltin's house some years ago, who was a very, very sweet man and a very good character actor. And it's just a fun romp of a film, very, very different in tone from what Romero was doing, or from what The Walking Dead or World War Z would end up doing. But because it's a horror comedy, but the emphasis is on comedy, and but it's very, very fun, and so I can recommend that. Then we get another one of my favorite films, and we mentioned James Cameron with Terminator, and that was just a ramp up to the big film he was going to make, and that, of course, was Aliens, and it is again one of my favorite films. When Alien came out in 1979 and it was a hit, the studio tried for years to develop an Alien sequel. And the problem they kept getting into, the bear trap they kept stepping into, was people would keep pitching riffs that were basically the same movie over and over again. That's been the problem with Terminator as well, which is how do you do a riff on that that's different, that expands the universe? And Cameron had been working on a movie, an idea of a movie himself, about these colonial Marines, and he went in to pitch a sequel to Alien, and he pitched this colonial Marines thing that was very, very, derivative of Starship Troopers, of Heinlein's novel, or I shouldn't say derivative, but certainly inspired by. I mean, it's clear in science fiction film who the fans of written science fiction were based on the films they made and the TV shows they made. And clearly Starship Troopers, which is back there, this is way before they made a movie of it, that very much had an influence on Aliens. And the fun part was he changed genres. Alien had been a science fiction horror film. Aliens is a science fiction action film. And they brought back Sigourney Weaver, and they told a completely different story from the original film. And instead of there just being one xenomorph, there are a bunch of them. And then he created the Alien Queen, because you've got to have something to ramp up with. You've got to have something, a payoff that's bigger. And again, this is a film where the director's cut helps, but you don't need to see the director's cut. But it is spectacular. It pays off enormously, and it is a film school lesson in how you create a number of characters and have them all be distinctive and all be memorable. Bill Paxton is terrific in it. Michael Biehn is terrific in it. Lance Henriksen is terrific in it. Sigourney Weaver. Carrie Henn, who plays Newt, is just amazing. And the visual design is great. Stan Winston's his design stuff is great. James Cameron is a phenomenal writer, director, and designer. And he'd come up through the Roger Corman school of things, and so he really knew how to make everything work brilliantly. So this is Aliens, and I think it's just incomparable. And if you've never seen it, again, another one to absolutely run and go see. Now we get to another one of the breakout directors. I mentioned him a little bit earlier with Scanners, but this was perhaps his big, peculiar film. There's something called body horror, and Alien was one of the big films that kind of put that across the plate. The idea of the human body changing and being disgusting, and fluids and all that stuff. And The Fly. Now, The Fly was a movie that had been made in the 50s with Al Hedison, later renamed David Hedison, who about a guy who invents a machine that is supposed to be teleporting him, but there's a fly that gets into it, and it, he gets the fly's DNA and the fly gets his, and it's a big mess. And it was based on a short story that appeared in Playboy, and it was made into a pretty cool little horror movie with Vincent Price. But it waited for David Cronenberg to make the great version of this story. And Jeff Goldblum, who later would be in Independence Day and many other great films, Jurassic Park, stars in this film. Gina Davis is the love interest, and she's terrific. And it's an amazing and upsetting film, very, very upsetting, which is what David Cronenberg specialized. He and David Lynch were sort of the two directors who would make very unsettling films. Ridley Scott had done that with Alien, but he didn't continue to do that film after film, whereas David Lynch and David Cronenberg were specialized in that kind of discomfort. And The Fly is about a man who gets the DNA of a fly, but instead of having a fly's head, like poor Al Hedison had, he gets the DNA where it makes him initially stronger and have more energy and be just better in every way, and then it starts to go south, and he becomes a monster, a nightmare. And the parallel they were drawing was with drugs, because by the time we get into the 70s and 80s, cocaine has run rampant, crack is out on the streets. And people are experimenting with heroin. That would go more into the 90s, but this is really very deliberately a parable of where at first you take the drugs and you feel wonderful, you feel energized and on top of the world, and then it becomes an addiction, and then you're destroyed. And that's the story they're telling via this science fiction horror film. And it is very, very powerful and creepy, and there you go. So also at the same time we get, and you can see there's an enormous range of tone in these science fiction films, but the cool part is an amazing range of tone that succeeds, that works, from science fiction comedy to science fiction horror to just adventure films, science. And when we get to adventure films and space opera, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home comes out. Again, It's directed by Nimoy, and it's just great. It's great. It's Saving the Whales. And again, they were trying many, many different takes on what to do with the Star Trek franchise. There was talk of Eddie Murphy being one of them at one point. There were many, many scripts being written that never saw the light of day. But this one was directed by Nick Meyer as well, and it's I think it was written by Nick Meyer, who had directed Wrath of Khan, and this one was directed by Leonard Nimoy, and it's great. It's great. It's a great fun film. It's set on modern day Earth, and it's about saving the whales so that an alien signal can be answered. And it was about ecology, and it has Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley and the whole crew, and it's charming. And in a certain way, Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 form a trilogy. Where it's a continuous storyline that goes, Spock dies, Spock is brought back, and then the save the whales. That forms from Star Trek 5 and beyond. Those would be kind of freestanding, but these three formed a unit, and it's charming and delightful. Now Saavik leaves in this episode, in this film at the very beginning. In the novel, they explained why, which is in the novel and in the script, she was pregnant from Spock's child from doing Pon farr with the adolescent Spock as he's quickly growing up in Star Trek 3. When I created with Michael Reeves and Winston Engel the George Takei Star Trek series, we actually had that grown son as a character, but that sadly that series never got greenlit. So, but we did write a series Bible for that George Takei Star Trek series, which I'm very proud of, and we outlined the pilot as well. But Star Trek 4 is fun. It's more of a romp than Wrath of Khan had been, and it's not as grim as Star Trek 3 had been. This one was overtly designed to have our Star Trek characters riffing on the 20th century and its eccentricities. And they actually took Walter Koenig, and he had him stand on a street corner, and I think in San Diego, and ask people where the nuclear vessel was. And those aren't extras; those are real people. They had him ask people, just going about their day, and it's really, really fun. And Walter Koenig is quite wonderful in every way, shape, and form. So that's another film that I can wholeheartedly recommend if you've never seen it. Then we get to another franchise. Now, they'd done Alien, so they were looking for another way of doing science fiction horror, and they came up with Predator. Now, I don't think Predator is on the same level as Alien, but it's fun. The creatures are fun. It spawned many movies and all sorts of stuff, and Schwarzenegger stars in it, and of course, he's iconic. And coming off Terminator into Predator, he was doing a number of action films, and this is one of the standouts, and it's a very, very solid and entertaining film, so I can recommend that one also. Now we get to another film. This was the decade, this in the 90s and the latter part of the 70s those were the decades that spawned franchises. And nowadays, where we primarily have superheroes and all of that, that wasn't what the 70s and the 80s and the 90s were about. You had some Superman sequels here with Christopher Reeve, but they were on the fade, and you didn't have Marvel movies yet where you were getting, the Mighty Thor and Iron Man and all of that. Iron Man would kick that off, but later. So what you were getting here were original properties. They might be based on a novel. They might be based on a short story. They might be something that had been made in the 50s but not fully realized. But then you started to get originals where there was no pre-existing property, but there was just an amazing, amazing film that was made. Now, Paul Verhoeven had established himself. He was a Dutch director. He had established himself with Soldier of Orange and other films which they shot back home, but now he's in America, and he wanted to do social satire, so he came up with RoboCop. And it's, I believe the script is by Ed Neumeyer, but this is a wonderful science fiction satire. And he would continue with the satirical tone in Starship Troopers later, but this, again, established many sequels, TV show, on and on. And Peter Weller's in it. He's really, really solid. It's a very good science fiction film. The visual design, the RoboCop suit, it looks great. Many other things in it are great. It's got a wonderful cast. Ronnie Cox, Kurtwood Smith is a great villain. Miguel Ferrara's in it. It's got a wonderful score by Basil Polidoris, who would also do Starship Troopers and Conan the Barbarian. and it's a classic. It's just a classic, as many of these films are. So now, and we're not even done with the 80s yet, guys. We're in 1988, and there's an animated film out of Japan. Now, Blade Runner had really set a tone in terms of future noir, and this film took that ball and ran with it. It was Akira, and it was a terrific Japanese science fiction film that proved very, very, very influential. And I don't have something to hold up of it, but if you've never seen it, definitely check it out. If you're into anime, definitely check it out, and you'll be well rewarded. So we're not even done yet. So then, continuing on, we get another great John Carpenter film. If ever this should have been a TV series, it wasn't, and I'm very sad about that. But by now we're into the Reagan years, and we've got a lot of conservative things going on, and a lot of the more liberal directors and writers are starting to respond to that. And so John Carpenter directed They Live, and it is perhaps not a great film, but the idea is wonderful, which is that aliens are running the world, and there's sunglasses you can put on where you see them rather than the humans they look like to everybody else. It's got Roddy Piper, who is a wrestler, starring in the lead, and I think it would have been better if they'd gotten someone, who was more of an actor, less of a personality. But it's, for all of the flaws, it's an amazing idea and just an amazing notion. And if ever there should have been something that spun off a TV show, it should have been this. And I still think it would make a great television show. And but since it hasn't yet, definitely check this film out. It's the creatures are great, the jokes are great. There's a fight scene that goes on and on and on between Roddy Piper and Keith David, Rowdy Roddy Piper, and Keith David, who had been brilliant in The Thing. Is one of John Carpenter's staples of actors, and this is quite a fun film. So now we get to one of my absolute favorite films, and this is not generally that well known. After doing Terminator and Aliens, James Cameron wanted to do something that was sort of like his lifelong dream to do. He had been a scuba diver. He loved the undersea world. He wanted to sort of a Close Encounters of the Third kind of movie, but set in the Marianas Trench. Now, ultimately, in later years, he would actually finance a diving bell, and he would go down to the bottom, the deepest part of the ocean, the Marianas Trench, but he wouldn't find in reality what he had found in fiction. And so he made this film. If you've only seen the theatrical release, you have not seen this movie. This is The Abyss. It's one of my absolute favorite films. You must see the director's cut. It's only on DVD. They've never released it on Blu-ray, sadly. But this is the great version. It's got a staggeringly great ensemble cast of Ed Harris in a phenomenal role. It's got Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. It's got Michael Biehn. It is a wonderful, wonderful film. The visual design is great. The aliens are very interesting. It's about the Cold War. It's just a terrific, terrific film, and I can't praise it highly enough. And then there was a novelization done of it by Orson Scott Card. This is the novelization where he actually tried to expand it and make it into a legit novel, not just kind of riff off the screenplay. But and Orson Scott Card, of course, was a major science fiction writer with Ender's Game, and but again, definitely check this out. And if you enjoy it, I actually did a panel with members of the cast and crew, and I think I posted that on Space Command. I think if you type in Abyss, you'll find it, because I just love that movie to death. And Ed Harris, who then of course would be seen in Westworld in more recent years, he's amazing in that film, and everything about that film is just great. Now at the end, they sort of ran out of money, so the ending moments are not as persuasive as the rest of the film. It was very difficult. They found a nuclear reactor that had never been started up, and they filled it with water, this big concrete space, and that's what they turned the bottom of the ocean into to keep it controllable. And it was a very, very difficult shoot, and but they really came out with something fabulous. And sadly, for lengths, for the reasons of length, they cut out all the character bits, which is what makes the movie breathe and live. And that movie came out, and it was a dud. It just was not a hit, but it should have been. And the full version, the full director's cut version, shows what it is. And if you watch it, I think you'll love it. I certainly do. And so now we're heading toward the last part of the 80s. We get a sequel to Back to the Future Part 2, which is a delightful film. And we also get Ghostbusters 2, which is a less delightful film. Now there's one film that somehow I went by and I didn't mention, but Richard Matheson, the great Twilight Zone and Star Trek writer, the writer of Duel, the writer of The Shrinking Man, so many classic works of horror and science fiction. I Am Legend. He wrote a love story, a time travel love story. Jack Finney was a friend of his, and Jack Finney had written a number of pieces about time travel. And so Matheson just went to the Hotel del Coronado, where they shot Something's Gotta Give, and he used that great turn-of-the-century hotel as an inspiration to create a fictional hotel and write a love story about a man going back in time and falling in love with a turn-of-the-century actress, and this time loop where they're endlessly in love. And it's one of the great romance films. But first it was a book. This is the first paperback edition, and it's signed by Richard Matheson, whom I knew because I wrote The Twilight Zone Companion, and he was a very dear man. And Matheson's title had been Bid Time Return, but the movie was called Somewhere in Time, and starred Christopher Reeve and Jane Alexander, and it was directed by Jeannot Swark, and he had been a director on Night Gallery, and I think that's how he met Matheson, and it's a lovely film, very sad, and but just a beautiful piece of work. Matheson has a cameo in it, and there's a Professor Finney that's Matheson's tip of the hat to Jack Finney, the other science fiction writer, who also, by the way, wrote Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So, I mean, all these people knew each other. All of them hung out and were friends, and, you know, science fiction is great that way. And you know, it's a wonderful film. You know, Christopher Reeve was, of course, coming off the fame of Superman, and very sadly, in later years, he would have a riding accident, and a horseback riding accident, and be left a quadriplegic and become a very noted spokesperson for quadriplegia research, but and sadly died far too young. But he's at the peak of his form in this movie. They have wonderful chemistry. Christopher Reeve and Jane Alexander. It's a lovely film. Matheson was inspired by a portrait he'd seen of the great turn-of-the-century actress Maud Adams, whom Peter Berry had written Peter Pan for. She was the first Peter Pan. She was incredibly beautiful. I have a terrific portrait of her up there. When Matheson came to my Twilight Zone party, he saw that portrait and said, "Where did you get that?" And I'll show it to you later. But it was, you know, he had started his mind started to go if he were able to go back in time and romance Maud Adams, and it made just a delightful film. Christopher Plummer's in it. And, you know, if you've never seen it, just run out and rent it now, or stay home and rent it, either way. But it's one of the great romantic films. So now we come to the last big, you know, game-changing film, kind of film on this list in the 80s. Not a great film. Star Trek V. Now that Leonard Nimoy had directed Star Trek and become a feature director in his own right, Shatner said, "Well, I'm going to direct." So he directed Star Trek V. It's not a good film. It's funky. It has Lawrence Luckinbill as Spock's brother. And I always have problems when a character who's very well established suddenly has relatives that pop up. You know, and I've had that same problem with Star Trek Discovery when it's like, oh, she's Spock's, you know, adopted sister, and, you know, Michael. And this one has Lawrence Luckinbill as his brother who's renounced logic and embraced emotion. And it's just funky. It's just a funky movie. And it has things that are kind of fun in it, but it's also got a lot of stuff that's kind of wacky. And people by this time were starting to complain that the cast was starting to look kind of elderly. And, you know, I like it, but you kind of have to grimace through certain moments of it. But again, the Star Trek films kept going. Star Trek VI would be made in the next decade and would be better, thank God. But so that's sort of the major films. In part two of my documentary, history of science fiction, the 80s movies, we'll talk about some of the lesser films like The Running Man, Battle Beyond the Stars, etc. There's a lot of them, and they're very fun, but I wanted to kind of just talk about the major films, the big films, the ones that sort of made science fiction, fantasy, and horror what they are now, where you have zombies as a franchise, you have the Terminator as a franchise, you've got Alien as a franchise, you've got all of these films, Predator, Blade Runner, they all began, these were films that were so powerful and so well done and so iconic and so influential that they spun out novels and comic books and other movies and TV shows and cartoon shows and on and on and on, billions and billions of dollars, and the Star Wars films included. And so this was the great era, the 80s and the 90s, where you got so many of the franchises that we have now that have enriched our lives, that have filled our fantasy worlds, that have made us able to go to all these delightful alternate realities where we can spend our time, not to mention video games that spun off from all of these things. So if there were some films that I mentioned that you've never seen, check them out. Or if there's films I mentioned that you have seen but you want to see again, great. And if you have any questions about any of these things, I was there during that period. I was primarily writing television, but these films were highly influential on me when I wrote for real Ghostbusters, or when I developed Captain Power as a show. Aliens had a big influence on that. And all of these great stories are continuing to influence me as a writer, producer, director, working in film and TV and books, and I know they continue to influence all of my friends who make television shows and movies. And these were influential, instrumental, great films, and they really, the men and women who made these films. Gail Ann Hurd was James Cameron's wife and producer and partner at the time, co-writer as well. Greg Jean, who was building the miniatures, the Skotak brothers, all of these people were making films that stood the test of time. It was like they were built houses that stood the test of time, that did not collapse. So many films are so shallow in intent and in execution, where you watch them and then they're just gone from your mind. Not so with these films. These films left a mark. They were made with love. They were crafted with heart, and they were just superlatively rendered. And so I'm very glad that I was writing and making television during that period, as well as writing books. And I'm glad I'm still here, still doing it. But again, many of these people I've met, I've known, I know what kind of people they are. They loved doing this. Nobody was a cynic who made any of these films. Nobody was a cynic who took part in them. Nobody was doing it just for the money. They were doing it because they loved it, because it was a dream come true. It was what they were put on this earth to do. And that's why I find this such a wonderful age of science fiction. And there were many more movies to come. We'll get into the 90s very shortly. Another great era. But by my lights, the current era that we're in is much more derivative, much less convincing, much less grounded, and there's a reason for that. But so we'll talk further. But I hope you've enjoyed my little history of science fiction films of the 80s. Part 2 will be coming soon, and thanks for being there. And again, we have a Kickstarter campaign going. Please go and throw some money our way. It'll allow me to finish Space Command and get it to you, which I very much want to do. I'm chomping at the bit. And it also helps make Mr. Sci-Fi and all the other things you enjoy. So if you've never contributed anything, you're just kind of riding on the coattails of those who are. Not to criticize, but I think you can spare $1 or $2 if you've been entertained by all the thousands of Mr. Sci-Fi commentaries I've now done. And spread the word. Let people know we've got a campaign going. If you're part of a fan group or a podcast or anything where you can get the word out to people who don't know about Mr. Sci-Fi or Space Command, that will be swell. So that's it for now, guys. We'll talk real soon, and hang in there and enjoy science fiction the way I do. Take care. Bye, guys.